You are listening to End of Life University podcast, real talk about life and death. This is episode number 129. Welcome to End of Life University podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt, hospice physician, author, and educator. In this podcast, I share thoughtful conversations with experts in various fields related to dying and death, and informative teaching sessions on preparing for the end of life by living fully today. And I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really glad you're here with me. Today, I'm going to be continuing just a brief series I'm running on death education. And today I'm excited to share with you an interview I did with Stacy Smith, who teaches a course on the psychology of death and dying to college students at our local community college here where I live. And I posted this interview in the past for End of Life University interview series, and it was one of the most popular interviews I've ever done. So I decided I wanted to share it with you again today because it fits in really well with this topic of death education for everyone. And so listen in to what Stacy has to say. She'll give some tips about teaching her death education class. And even if you're not hoping to teach at a college level, I think you'll find these tips useful if you yourself would like to get involved in death education. So just a couple of announcements before we get started. As I alluded, my initiative for 2018 is to promote death education for everyone. And so that's why I'm doing a little mini series here on death education. I have also created a free PDF titled Teaching Guidelines for a Death and Dying Class. And so this PDF just has information about getting started with a class. So deciding what type of class you'd like to teach and what subject you'd like to address in a death and dying class, picking a venue, attracting students, creating a syllabus. Those are just some of the topics that I've addressed in this little free guide that you can download by going to eoluniversity.com/guidelines. With an S on the end, guidelines. You can also just come to the show notes for this episode, number 129, at eolupodcast.com. And you'll find a link to the guidelines there as well. But you're welcome to download those if you have any interest at all in teaching any sort of a death and dying class, whether it's just a one-time workshop in your community on how to complete advanced directives, whether you'd like to do an ongoing series at maybe your local library or start a film series or in some other way teach death and dying education in your community. I hope this guideline is helpful to get you started and give you some things to think about and work through. And then in the month of March, I'm hoping to put together a small work group. And this would really be probably just 10 or 12 people that I would invite, people who have signed up to download the guidelines. I'm going to invite to join this work group with me. And for about 4 days in a row, we're going to be brainstorming each day how each person in the group can put their class together and kind of talking through ideas for them, giving them any resources they might need for a class. And at the very end of the month, we'll regroup and meet and see how their plans are coming along and how they've done at actually putting that class together. So that work group will take place in March of 2018. So if you're listening to this later, you've probably missed that opportunity, but there may be other I may offer it again at other times. So you can always go to eoluniversity.com/guidelines and get the guidelines, and you'll get the latest updates on what's available as far as work groups or classes that you can attend about putting together a death and dying class. So So be sure to get the guideline. And I also want to remind you that this podcast is sponsored by generous donations made through my page at patreon.com/EOLU. Patreon is a crowdfunding site where people who enjoy content like these episodes of this podcast can step up and contribute as little as $1 a month to help support the ongoing effort of putting the podcast out there. So my page is patreon.com/EOLU. I'm so grateful to all the supporters who've been making contributions for the last year and helping me keep things afloat here with the podcast and also with End of Life University interview series. And so if you do sign up and become a supporter, you'll receive lots of little benefits. You'll get a monthly Q&A call that I call the Hospice Happy Hour, where I answer your questions about end-of-life issues. If you become a Platinum supporter, which is $5 a month or more, you'll receive unlimited access to replays of all the current interviews for End of Life University. So you'll be able to listen to those at any time through the Patreon page, and other benefits from time to time. So anyway, patreon.com/EOLU if you're interested. No obligation, but do check it out if you'd like to know more about becoming a contributor. So now we'll get on to the interview with Stacey Smith, where we're talking about death education for college students. I hope you enjoy it. And as always, stay tuned until after the interview, and I'll share with you my takeaways from Stacey's interview. Here we go. And today we'll be talking about how to start a death and dying class for college students in your community. And I'm so excited to welcome my guest, who is my friend and colleague, Stacey Smith. And I'll tell you a little bit more about her. Stacey has a degree in counseling education and counseling psychology from the University of Colorado at Denver. She created a legacy program for 5 to 18-year-olds dealing with grief and loss. She has been in private practice for 14 years, and she does quite a lot of grief counseling within her private practice. And she has been teaching at Colorado Mountain College for 5 years, including her class, The Psychology of Death and Dying, and that's what we're going to be discussing in detail today. She's currently writing a book about destigmatizing mental health illness and treatment. And I know Stacey personally, and I've had the privilege of being a guest lecturer at her class on death and dying, which has been a lot of fun for me. So I thought it would be great to share that information with you in case anyone out there listening has an interest in starting a class themselves on death and dying. So Stacey, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Karen.
Well, I've really been looking forward to just talking with you and diving into your class and sharing with everyone how amazing it is. But I was hoping first you'd just fill us in on how did you first get interested in the subject of death and dying and grief?
Well, it's a little bit of a long story, but I took a class on death and dying when I was an undergrad at the University of Rhode Island. And it was a requirement in my psych program at the University of Rhode Island. And as I continued with my education as a graduate, and I'm partially working through my PhD currently, and I've always been shocked that we've never had to do any follow-up surrounding that. So when I started teaching at Colorado Mountain College, my first class started going well, and my dean came to me and said, "Would you like to teach another class?" And I was thrilled to pieces. So she pulled out the big catalog of psych classes that they wanted to offer and was going through all of the kind of national classes that are offered. And she said, "Well, there's human sexuality." And she goes, "Oh, and there's this class called The Psychology of Death and Dying." And I started jumping up and down, and I got really excited. And she kind of looked at me perplexed and said, "You want to teach a class on death and dying?" And I said, "Yes, I want to teach a class on death and dying, and I think everybody should take this class." And I started, kind of vomiting verbally ideas at her. And she looked at me and she said, "Clearly this is something that you're excited about and passionate about. I'm going to let you take it and run with it. And she let me create this class as long as I was meeting the state guidelines and do what I want to do. And so I've been able to pour myself into this. But death is the greatest equalizer on the planet, Karen. It is the one thing that we are all guaranteed to deal with. And so I think it is something that we need to be talking about. And it's an unfortunate state of affairs that here in the United States, it's become such a taboo subject that we don't even talk about it. And then we become fearful of talking to people who are suffering with grief and loss. So we kind of ignore it and brush it under the rug. And teaching a class like Death and Dying allows us to get out there and talk about this and get comfortable with it because we're all going to do it.
And I love that you're teaching it at the college level. So you're reaching young people who, at least from what I found, tend to be more open-minded, but this will be a benefit to them for the rest of their lives, that they've already opened up to this information. They've already had conversations, already learned about death and dying, so they'll be able to go through the rest of their lives with so much less fear.
Karen, I've had students, I've been teaching this class now, I think I am in my 12th or 13th semester, and I've had students come up to me several years after taking the class and say, thank you for changing my life. Because they are, I've got sometimes 15-year-olds in my class, and sometimes I've got 70-year-olds in my class. But these 20-somethings, they're not thinking about their own mortality, and they're certainly not thinking about their parents' mortality, because a lot of them have had experience with death, and others have had no experience with death. But the thought of preparing for their own death and accepting their own mortality is not something that is at the forefront of their thoughts. And I've had students come to me and say, I am living my life completely differently because I took this class and I've accepted my own mortality and I understand that I'm going to die and deal with that.
Wow, that's so inspirational and also so exciting, because I feel like if we really are going to change our national conversation about death and dying, we do have to reach all age groups. We can't just be talking to seniors at the very end of their lives and getting them to accept the fact they're going to die. We need this full cross-section of age groups to be involved in the discussion.
I completely agree with you, and I think it's very interesting because as we watch the life expectancy continue to expand here in the United States, we've got this elderly population that is the most underutilized resource in the country. And I talk to my students about, you may be 20 years old, but right here in your backyard, there's a 65-year-old, there's a 75-year-old, there's an 80-year-old that can help you figure out your future, and they want to help you. Don't see them as helpless people. And you're right, we do focus on the elderly and getting prepared for end of life because they appear to be at that place in life. Yet, I think part of the reason why I love discussing death is, as a species, we like to have control. And the one thing we have no control over is when we're going to die, how we're going to die, where we're going to die. And we don't know what's going to happen when we die. So that's part of the fear factor. And if we start talking about it, we can eliminate a great deal of fear.
Oh, that's exactly right. Well, I was wondering, Stacy, going all the way back to the very first semester you taught this class, what was the reception like amongst the students who signed up? Like, did you have any trouble getting students to sign up for it, or was there a lot of interest in it?
Well, the interesting thing is that they put the class on the schedule, and my boss said, I don't think this class is going to go because I don't think anybody's really going to understand what it is. And I said, just let it be what it's going to be. And I filled the class. And by filling the class, I had 12 students. And I always do an icebreaker in the first class to kind of build some community because we're talking about death, and that's a little scary for people. So I always ask my students, well, why are you here? And I would say almost every semester, including that first semester, at least 50% of them say, out of curiosity, I wanted to know what this was about. So, it's great for them we're curious about death. And I think you put a title like The Psychology of Death and Dying, and you're going to get people interested in it. So those first semester students were an amazing group of people. And then they went out and started pumping the class, and I've never had problem filling class since then.
Well, and having been a participant in your class, so I've had the privilege of meeting a lot of your students, but also seeing like it's a lot of that is you, Stacy, because you're a great teacher and your energy is fantastic and the students love you. Every time I'm there, I always hear like, oh, I heard what a great teacher Stacy was, so I couldn't wait to take a class from her. So I think you yourself are part of that, the popularity of your class.
I thank you, Karen. I don't know how true that is. I think that I am such a ridiculously passionate person about this that my inner nerd about death and dying and psychology comes out and it just overflows all over them. And I don't think that they can avoid my enthusiasm.
Well, I assume that the college administration has been on board with the class, like they seem to be happy with it and are happy that you're teaching it.
They're thrilled to pieces with it. The administrators have been fabulous, and so fabulous that we are talking with the nursing program because that's one of the 4-year degrees that we offer, making this a prerequisite for nursing or at least a requirement for nursing students. I have found a lot of, because we've got an outdoor wilderness program at our school and we've got an EMT program at our school, so a lot of the students that are getting into those fields, they've heard about the class and they're taking it upon themselves to take it so that they're more prepared as medical professionals because they know they're going to deal with death and they want to be prepared to deal with the patient and the family members.
And that's so perfect because for sure everyone in any aspect of, in any sort of health-related field needs to be familiar with death and dying and needs to be literate in death and dying and able to talk to people about it, although let alone our entire society needs to become more literate. But I'm thrilled to hear that you're getting a lot of those students who want to take the course.
Yes, and I agree with you. I think that in a lot of my class, because it is a psychology class, we do talk about the medical profession and how the two fields work together. And a lot of times I think that the assumption is, particularly at a hospital or an oncology department or even in hospice care, that they're going to bring in a mental health professional to discuss these things with the family, yet it's the hospice nurse or the nurse on the floor or the doctor that's involved with the case or the general practitioner that's been treating the family for generations. This family really wants to talk to. They don't want a mental health professional brought in to discuss these very intimate details of end of life with them and what the grieving process is like, although we're happy to do so. And so I think having medical professionals well-versed is going to make that grieving process a lot less scary and potentially a lot less painful.
Yes, absolutely. So let's talk a little about the class itself. And could you give us kind of an overview? I don't know if you can kind of summarize like what your semester's like and some of the varieties of topics that you cover in your class.
Absolutely. Like I said, the first class, I do a lot of community building and icebreakers because it is a very intimate subject to discuss in a classroom. It's very subjective, and you've got to remember that there are a lot of cultural and religious belief systems that come to play in a subject like this, and so building respect so that people can talk openly is really important. And I continue that team building throughout the course of the semester. Then when weather allows, because we live at 10,000 feet, I take the students to our local historic cemetery, and I have one of our local historians do a tour with them. That's, again, comfort level with death, hanging out in a cemetery because they're not scary places, and learning about the history of death. So then for the rest of the semester, I'm working on the history of death throughout the world, culturally, religiously, and here in the United States, because we used to have a great relationship with death in the United States. And we went awry in about the 1800s, and we need to come back to it and make it a community-based event so that people feel safe and are wrapped around when they experience a death. So we go through a lot of history, both globally and locally and nationally. I talk a lot about hospice, euthanasia, the Death with Dignity Act. I show a film that is absolutely fabulous about the Death with Dignity Act in Oregon and Washington called How to Die in Oregon. I use books in my class a lot. Tuesdays with Maury, I think, is one of the most beautifully written stories about not only the person who's going through their dying process, but the person that's going through the process with them.
Mm-hmm.
And there's reflection papers, because I'm always checking in with my students to make sure that they're doing okay, because a subject like this can trigger people, and I want to make sure that they're feeling safe and they're okay. We talk about how to die in America, because we die very differently in America than a lot of places in the world. I talk about legal stuff, so because death is a big industry, so we talk about how that's a big industry, funeral homes, types of burials, being prepared for death, so having a living will, having your estate in order, having a will in order, letting your family and friends know what you want in your death. Because if we can prepare those around us that we love for what we want in our death, it allows them to grieve in a much more healthy fashion.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think. I have the coroner come in and speak to the students. She talks about what she does and how she calls a death. You come in and talk about your experience in hospice care and as a medical professional. Mm-hmm. I am working desperately on getting a funeral home director to come in and speak to us. So I bring in every possible aspect of the process of death and dying and the psychology of it and talk about it. And we talk about the stages of grief, of course. And then they end the semester with picking a religion, a culture, either current or historical, that they want to write a paper about, and they culminate everything they've learned for the semester in that, and they do a presentation on that culture and teach their classmates about it.
Wow. That's amazing. That's an incredible curriculum. And actually, I would love to take the class myself. I mean, it sounds really interesting that you cover so many different areas of death and dying.
Oh, we have so much fun with it, Karen. I would love it if you took it.
Yeah, well, it's been so much fun when I've been able to be a guest teacher, just working with young people, and just their humor and their attitudes are fun and kind of delightful to be around.
Well, and they're like sponges. I mean, you think about it. When you were 20, 22, 25, were you thinking about your own mortality or your parents' mortality? Absolutely not, because even the part of our brain that fully develops that says that can happen to me, there are consequences to my behavior, it doesn't fully develop until our mid to late 20s. Yeah. And so to see these people and thinking about these things and then telling their stories, because inadvertently at the beginning of the semester, some people will say, I've had experience with death. And then as we're talking about different subjects, if we're talking about suicide or we're talking about euthanasia or death with dignity or all different kinds of death, because there's appropriate death, there's inappropriate death, then stories start coming out of them and they're like, oh my gosh, I totally forgot that happened in my life and that happened in my life. Because unfortunately, as Americans, we're trained to brush death under the rug.
Oh, and particularly for younger people, and that's a subject I've talked about here before, how we have no idea how to handle death and dying for younger people, the children in our families. So if they have been through a death experience during their childhood in the family, chances are no one ever helped them process it or ever talked them through it or worked with them on death and dying. So that's why it's coming up in this class, because they have never had the opportunity before to talk about it.
Yes, and I think that's the unfortunate thing, Karen, is that we're afraid to talk about it. And if you go up to somebody that's had a death at any point in their life and you say, how are you doing? And then you say, how are you handling the loss of or the death of? You're afraid that you're going to open up wounds. Well, those wounds are there. And yes, we have found in the field of psychology that talking about these things help us heal. But we're so afraid to talk about death because we don't want to make that person that we're talking to sad. So we think we're doing the right thing and we think we're being protective. And that's part of the reason why this program that I created with a local camp, Legacy, was so important, because these children are experiencing death in the family and nobody's talking about it. So we've given them a place where we're bringing, everybody's there for the same reason. Somebody in their family has died. And so they all know they're there for the same reason. So we don't even have to talk about it, and they can talk about it, and they can act out their emotions in a safe place where it's judgment-free.
Exactly, and where they don't stand out and feel like I'm the odd person here who's been through this. Everyone there has been through something similar, so they have a peer group at least that they can connect with and relate to.
Absolutely, and it normalizes it for them, because if you talk to a child that's experienced the loss of a sibling or a parent or an aunt or uncle, it depends on the type of death and the tragedy of the death. A grandparent, not so much, unless the grandparent was living in the house and was a primary caregiver. And they'll say, I'm the only kid whose parent ever died, whose brother or sister ever died, or whose grandparent ever died. And that's, where the brain is developed when you're 8, 9, 10, 11 years old or even younger, because it's a very egotistical stage to begin with. And then they get with other kids and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm not the only person that's gone through this. And somebody out there feels possibly the way I do. And it's amazing to watch just their body language change when they see people their age who are all there for the same reason.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm sure. And I know in your class, I've just witnessed some of the students there who, as you say, are there because they have a grief story of their own that they really need help with, and you can kind of tell how relieved they are to just be able to speak it, to just be able to say, this happened in my life. And so your class and then the camp as well for younger children are what an amazing benefit they're offering to these young people to help them with their grief and then help them also be accepting of their own mortality.
Well, and I find it fascinating, Karen, because inadvertently I'll have at least one student throughout the course of the semester say, oh my gosh, this is like the best group therapy I've ever done. And I'm like, I'm glad that that's what you're getting out of the class. And then I'll bump into that person a semester or two later, if not longer, and they'll be like, I had no idea how much I was learning. And I always remind my students and the people that I help create a course like this that it can be like group therapy, but that they're still learning, and we've got to, have a nice balance between that, allowing a place for them to be safe and to share, and also continue to learn.
Exactly. Now, here's one question I have, and this is as someone who's never taught in college level or in the school system. I know that you have to turn in grades for your students, and I've been really curious about how do you grade for this class? Like, how do you give students grades? I'm just curious about that.
I would say that that's the hardest part of my job, Karen, is it's a subjective subject. So their participation in the classroom is definitely the largest part of their grade. So that means that they have to be live, they have to be present, and they have to be participating. I am constantly walking around the room and kind of, physically, non-verbally checking in with my students. I give them things so like they have to write their own obituary. They have to write their own epitaph, which is not an easy thing for a lot of people to do. You should see the look on my students' faces when I throw it at them. They have to do these reflection papers, so I'm checking in so that I've got something to grade. But when it comes down to doing the final grade at the end of the semester, when I have students make it through the semester, I feel like every one of them deserves an A because they put themselves out there and survived a class like this.
Yes, exactly.
And it is rare that if a kid makes it through, any student makes it through the entire class, that they get any less than an A-, because if they've made it through the class, they've done the work. And I have a decent attrition rate in a class like this just because the subject matter can get very unnerving for people, and I inadvertently lose at least one or two at the beginning of the semester when I'm like, oh my gosh, we're going to have so much fun. And they look at me like, really, crazy lady, we're going to have fun with death and dying. Awesome.
Yeah, I was curious about that, about if anyone drops out. So it sounds like that happens every semester.
It does, and it's expected. I mean, we have the same attrition rate with almost every class because life happens and students register for classes and then something happens and they can't do it. But I can almost look around the room on that first class and be like, I know you're not coming back, and I know you're not coming back.
I'm sure you can just see it in their faces.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's almost a look of terror, Karen. They're looking at you like, why would anybody talk about this?
Yeah, I can imagine they wonder, like, wait, I thought I was signing up for a psychology class.
And yet, I would attest that this is the most important psychology class any student could ever take.
Well, you mentioned that you always go on a field trip, or weather permitting, to a cemetery. But I remember one semester when I was there, maybe this was an extra credit project because it was in the fall semester. There's a haunted house in the area, and that they could take a tour of for extra credit.
It's a haunted tour of the town of Breckenridge.
Oh.
And when I'm coaching other professors or teachers on how to do this, I beg of them, because if you look in any community, you're going to find something like this. Because as much as we don't talk about death, we are certainly fascinated and intrigued by that spiritual world. And so in the fall, because it's the Halloween season and Dia de los Muertos, so it's kind of for certain beliefs and cultures, a very heightened time for spiritual activity. So I offer extra credit to my students to go do the historic haunted tour of Breckenridge.
That sounds like so much fun.
It is fun, and they come back, and the stories that they have, because the women that do this tour are absolutely fascinating, and they are fascinated with the spiritual world and the possibility of ghosts and orbs. And so they have ghost hunting apps, and they've got all kinds of ghost hunting apparatus that they use during the tours. But the beautiful thing is, and this is another one of those moments where you don't even realize you're learning because you're having so much fun, you're getting a tremendous amount of history about death in the community and how the community responded to death.
Wow. Yeah, that's fascinating, and what a great way to learn and to be exposed to a subject matter that you've never thought about before.
Exactly, and that's why I love it, because they don't even know they're learning.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the aspects that really impressed me and that made me recognize just how creative you can be with a class like this. It doesn't have to be sitting down with textbooks and taking notes and memorizing facts. It could be really fun to learn about death and dying.
It's so much fun. And the publishers won't love this, but I tossed the textbook 2 semesters ago and just started teaching it with the material that I have and the guest speakers that I have come in, and then the assignments and research that my students have to do. So that's part of what they have to do. Is I give them subject matter at the end of each class, and they have to come in with their own personal research that they've discovered on their own, as opposed to reading it from a textbook. Because then they get to add their own personal interest into what they're looking at, which is absolutely fascinating, because I learn every semester, every class from my students.
Wow. So how great for you as a teacher to actually get to be a student as well within the class.
I think that that's part of the reason what you said earlier about my students love me and the reputation I have is I'm not afraid to learn from my students. I'm not afraid to have my students say, wait a minute, Stacy, I found something different than that. Because they're the ones that are doing the research. I'm constantly researching this stuff and delving into it, but they're looking at different avenues of it. And because this field is kind of growing and booming right now, there's a lot out there, and clearly I can't be on top of all of it. So I think that that's one of the most important things if you're going to consider teaching a class like this is you've got to remember that you're a leader and your students are looking to you, but you can learn as much from your students as they can from you.
Yeah, so I like the idea that your curriculum is really pretty dynamic. It's not just static, rote lessons that you're teaching every week. It's changing all the time and dynamic, and you're responding to what's happening in the world right now and in our community.
It's really kind of cool because last semester I had our local coroner coming into class, and she usually comes to us on campus, and we live in a ski resort, so I contract with our ski resort. If there's been a death on the mountain, I'll go and do debrief with staff members and employees. So we had a death on the mountain, and there were 2 really bad car accidents the morning that the coroner was supposed to come teach my class last semester. And she called me and said, is there any way you can bring the students to the hospital where her office is, because I've got 2 patients that are in CAT scan and we don't know if they're going to make it, and I need to be here to call it if they're not going to make it. And I said, sure, I'll bring them over there, because the irony is that I need you to take over the class because I've got to get to the ski resort to do debrief with people. So I got all of my students over to the coroner's office. they got to see her in action. Obviously, they didn't get to go down and see what was going on in the ER, but to see her in action and the emotional dynamics of what she does for a living and getting prepared to possibly tell a family that your family member has died and go through that process was really powerful for my students. And fortunately, both of those people did live. One unfortunately died about a month later. But it was really, really powerful for my students to be able to witness all of that and see both of us in action. Because I drove over to the hospital, got them all set up, said, I got to go because I got to go do this. So talk about a great learning lesson.
Wow, I'll say. I mean, that is incredible. And who knew? You can't write that into a syllabus.
Half of what goes on in my classroom, I couldn't pay to have occur. And I think that's the beautiful thing about teaching a subject matter like death and dying is you got to be malleable and you got to go with the flow. And like you said, you've got to go with what's going on in the world. You've got to go with what's going on in your community, because if a tragedy occurs in your community, it's a great teaching opportunity. If there's an event that occurs in the world, it's a great teaching opportunity. I was teaching a class a year ago, October, and got a phone call that one of my husband's best friends had died. And instead of leaving the classroom, I let my students sit with me and watch me process the initial shock of the grief of finding out that somebody that was very close to me and my husband and my family had passed away. And it was such a rare opportunity, but you can't take that kind of opportunity in a lot of other classes. But a class like this, you can.
Yeah, wow. I mean, it's totally a class about life and death. I mean, it's a yes. living, live, organic class that's about this is how we live in a world where everyone dies. This is how you stay alive and you keep surviving, even though everyone will eventually die.
Well, and one of my favorite quotes from Tuesdays with Maury that my students come back to me constantly with is, you've got to learn how to die in order to live. And I think that is so true. And without having read that book and knowing that quote, that was kind of the premise of this class was, if we can accept our own mortality and learn to accept others' mortality and our own death, and that we're all going to experience it, it is utterly amazing how freeing it is that we can live life.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, you're already demonstrating. I was going to ask you, what are the character traits of a good teacher for a death and dying class? And you, of course, demonstrate those in your passion and your energy for it, but also your creativity and flexibility in the moment, and then being open-minded about anything, anything that goes with death and dying. But is there anything else you would say, any other criteria that has to be met for someone to be a teacher of a death and dying class?
I would think, and thank you for all of those compliments. I think if you're passionate about death and dying, you've got all of those qualities, to be quite honest with you. And I don't think that somebody that would say, yeah, I want to teach a death and dying class, wouldn't have those qualities. I think it is very important, and I think part of the reason why the flow of my class works so well is because I'm a professional. I am a clinician. I work in private practice, because if something does come up, I'm equipped to handle that as well. And so if the teacher or professor maybe weren't a practicing clinician or didn't necessarily feel comfortable with that, making sure that there's somewhere on campus that you can say to your student, I get that this is coming up. I'm here to listen to you, but if it goes beyond my scope of comfort, I'm going to get you to the right place.
I guess that's true, because you never know what might come up for a student in your class and what might push a button or trigger emotions that haven't been dealt with in the past in the midst
yes.
of your class.
Yes, I've had students run out of the classroom crying. I've had students call me in the middle of the night. Unfortunately, I'm not available then because I set pretty solid boundaries, but leaving me messages saying, oh my gosh, I had no idea this was going to affect me this way, or they'll email me or text me. And I think that's one of the most important qualities of teaching this class is you got to be available to your students.
Mm-hmm. And so if someone doesn't really have the clinical skills to meet those needs, they need to make sure there's someone backing them up who does, that they have resources.
Absolutely. And every campus has resources, and so just making sure that they're armed with, this is where you go, this is what you do, and I'm going to help you get there. But again, I don't think there's any person on this planet that would say, I want to teach this class, that didn't have the natural ability to be empathic, and that's the most important thing.
Yeah. So, Stacy, was there any kind of pushback that you had to overcome in order to start this class, like either from the college administration or other faculty or the community? Anything negative at all?
Well, when I initially said I wanted to teach this class, like I said, my dean looked at me and was like, fine, we're going to put it on the books and see what happens with this. Kind of like, there's no way we're going to fill this class. And then the women that work at the front desk and the counselors at the school, that help students find their classes, would come up to me and say, what is this class? Why are you teaching about death and dying? And what is the purpose? And it's amazing over the course of 3 years that I've been teaching this class now, the way that my colleagues and cohorts push this class and encourage students to take it. The school counselor, she's got a better name than that, and for the life of me, because she's just Jean to us, she's a student advisor. She'll look at a kid and see that they're struggling with something in life and say, this might be a really good class for you. And so not only are they earning college credit, or they're learning a lot about psychology, but they're getting some personal insight into themselves. Yeah. And I think education, kind of like medicine, has to be holistic.
Yes, absolutely. Wow, that's really fascinating how everyone in the college has kind of grown along with you in the class and started to recognize the value and appreciate it.
It's actually kind of funny. So I like to have a little bit fun with them, Karen, because usually there's faculty meetings going on Wednesdays when I teach, and they're across the hall from where my classroom is, and you will see people going into the faculty meeting and walking around the door of my classroom. Like, if they get too close to the door of my classroom, they might get sucked in and have to talk about death.
That's really interesting.
And so, because I'm morbid and I love to have fun with people, because I think through fun and being able to find some humor in it, we get more comfortable. So, like, the coroner will bring in, some bones and artifacts, and I'll just walk up and down the hallway holding a skull, or she'll have some evidence that has been cleared from scenes, especially suicide scenes or murder scenes, and I'll just kind of walk up and down the hall with that, and you should see them. And now they're like, oh my gosh, there's Stacy with that skull that they've never been able to find the body for.
So you have kind of quite a reputation, I'm sure.
Unfortunately, I think.
Well, I think it should be obvious to all of our listeners that you really do know how to instill fun into the subject of death and dying. And as much as that sounds like an oxymoron, that's really the attitude that we all need to have. It's so refreshing if we can look at death and dying in society with just that kind of lightheartedness, and it's a fact of life. It's going to happen. Why not see it from all sides, and why not learn how to laugh at it while we're making the best of it?
Absolutely, Karen. I mean, and we all know it's going to be painful when we're faced with it, but if we can have that comfort level of it's going to happen, and it's okay to talk about it, and it is okay for me to go and cry on somebody's shoulder or get angry about it, then it allows us to grieve in a much more healthy fashion, because we don't have to grieve privately. We can do it publicly, and there are stats from all over the world on cultures where it's part of the culture to grieve publicly, and how much healthier they are with their grief and loss process.
Oh, exactly. Well, I was remembering reading about, like, in some cultures in the past, like, people would wear mourning clothes, like certain clothing that would indicate that they're in mourning, like black or whatever it is. And initially I thought, wow, that's kind of like like labeling the person or something. But later I had the thought that in a way it's really good because they're publicly showing the world like, yes, this has happened and I'm living with it and dealing with this grief now. But it gives other people a chance to just be aware of it, to be aware day to day, every day there's someone in our midst who's grieving. There's a person we see at the grocery store every day who's grieving. There's someone dying that we probably encounter in our day-to-day lives. And here we are, oblivious to that all the time.
Isn't that the truth, though? I mean, I do. I think it is a beautiful thing to kind of put it out there that I am going through this time in my life that is not easy. And no matter what I'm teaching, whether I'm working with my clients, I'm working with my own children, or I'm working with my students, I am trying to constantly remind people that you have no idea what is going on for the person sitting next to you, in the line next to you, in the classroom, wherever you are. And so please be cautious with your words and try to be kind. Because we don't know, like you said, is somebody mourning? Is that person in their own dying process?
Mm-hmm. And we have no idea, and we've chosen as a society not to put that out in the open. We've chosen to keep it hidden from our view. So all we can do is, as you say, just be careful with our words with everyone and be kind with everyone.
Yes, and I am so optimistic for what's going on. I think there's a big movement. I think because of finances. I think because of the green movement. So we're looking at green funerals now. Green funerals are a lot less expensive than your traditional funeral. So I think that because of that, we're starting to become more open and talking about these things.
Yes. Oh, yes. I see it all around us in every area. I think things are really opening up, which is so exciting. It's kind of exciting to be on the leading edge of that change and able to watch it happen before our eyes.
Oh, I just love it. I really do. And I'm so excited for us as a species, as U.S. citizens, because I think that as these discussions occur, other discussions are going to come to light, and we're going to find that things can be a lot healthier and more comfortable if we just talk to one another.
Yes, absolutely. And Stacy, one of the outcomes that I'm hoping for from this conversation you and I are having is that there will be listeners out there who say, hey, I could teach a class like that, and who might feel inspired or even excited by the idea of creating their own class on death and dying. So I was wondering, just if you have tips for someone who's kind of starting from scratch, if you could sort of lead them through the process of what they might need to do, because I know you told me you have helped some people start classes. If you could give a few suggestions for what someone might do who would like to create a class.
Well, first and foremost, go to your dean and make sure that they're willing to have it happen. Find what interests you. Of course, you've got to stay within the state guidelines, but the state guidelines on this class are actually quite loose because nobody wants to talk about it. I mean, it really is kind of your golden ticket as a teacher to be able to run with it. So what interests you and what fuels you? And like you asked me, why would you teach a class like this? And the minute I was asked, I had the class built within 5 minutes. Reach out to people in the local community to see if you can get, because if you can get people that are experts in this arena to come and speak to the students, that's how you engage the students. I do recommend finding a textbook, at least initially, because I used a textbook for the first several semesters to help guide me and get me through and give me ideas. So I think a good textbook. There are so many amazing and beautifully written stories like Tuesdays with Maury that whatever speaks to you as the educator, so that you've got that passion and your heart's in it, to have your students read so that you can share that with them and open up dialogue.
Well, one question is, to teach at a college level, do you have to have a master's degree at least?
Yes, you do. It depends on the level of the school. And it also depends on experience, but you have to have at least a master's degree. If not, most college campuses prefer PhD. I'm fortunate because I'm teaching at a community college. We've got special labeling because we've got 4 years programs. And I'm also partially through my PhD. But yes, at least a master's degree to teach. But you go to a large university, you've got the PhD teaching, and you've got TAs working on their master's teaching a class like this. And I think that guided with the right professor, a TA could be the right person to teach this because they're young and they're right there experiencing it.
Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if there's someone who doesn't have the master's degree and maybe can't teach at the college level, do you think this sort of class would just work in the community, like at a community center or a senior center or something for someone to put out there for adult education? Do you think that would go?
100%, whether it's at a senior center or even through churches or synagogues or whatever religious organization there is. I mean, we've got a senior center here in Summit County where a discussion like this was held just last week, and community colleges are almost in every community now, and they're always looking for a way to draw people in. And when you put out that you're going to talk about death and dying and preparing for the end-of-life process, everybody's got a little bit of morbid curiosity, so they're coming through. They want to hear about it, and they want to, it's kind of like a train wreck. I want to see what's going on, and I want to see what happened, but I don't know that I want to participate.
Yeah. Yeah, how true. How true. Well, so that's why I don't want anyone to be discouraged who feels like, wow, I have so much experience and knowledge. I could teach a class like this. And even if you don't have an education degree and you don't have a master's, like think about, could you use your expertise at the community level and put it out there and offer it? Because I think it's just so important, and especially the diverse curriculum that you're offering. Because I do see we offer a lot of classes on how to complete your advanced directives and how to do estate planning and things like that. But the whole subject of death and dying is so broad and diverse. So that's why I love that you're covering everything.
Well, and I think that's where, if you've got an interest in death and dying and you're looking at getting a discussion going in your community, I say try and get the discussion going, because if we're talking about it and the more of us that are talking about it, the higher the comfort level is. And it doesn't require, I have to have a master's degree to teach at a college level because people are earning college credits and going on. But just to have a public discussion about this, I think it just requires passion and comfort.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And then the willing to just be creative and go with the flow, go with whatever comes up and whatever it presents itself.
Yes, and be mentally prepared because you have no idea what's going to be presented.
So true, so true. Well, the other thing that just occurred to me is that this class must have a tremendous ripple effect. I'm just imagining it on the whole campus, first of all, because I'm imagining the students who take your class go back and talk to their friends and tell their roommates about it, and then they go home and tell their parents about it. That's what's kind of really gratifying about the whole thing, how what an impact you can have from one small class with 12 students.
And that's what I love about it, because these guys start talking about it and they go and talk to their parents. And our coroner's office is also, because we live in a small community, in charge of kind of the emergency response when there has been a death. And several of my students have gotten jobs with the coroner's office, and so they go on scene when there's a death.
Wow. And isn't that amazing? Because they've had the training they need to be comfortable with death and not be afraid of working with it.
And then they're there to help the people in the emergency situation where they've lost a family member or a friend and help them begin their grieving process. And so, yes, the ripple effect has been absolutely amazing.
Well, I'm really excited about the idea that this might become a required course for nursing students, because there's an opportunity for an even greater ripple effect within the medical system itself, which I think would be fantastic.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I have generally a couple of nursing students a semester that just say, I heard about this class and I'm going to take this class because I know it's going to make me a better nurse.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And at least what I remember hearing from students in the class, it's not that they're all intending to be hospice nurses, that many of them just want to work in other areas, but they still recognize they need to be able to talk about death and dying.
Absolutely. I mean, the majority of them actually talk about going into pediatrics or labor and delivery. So you're talking about being on the opposite end of that kind of beginning of life process. But unfortunately, or fortunately, how you perceive it, death occurs at all ages in all scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
And so being prepared for it, and yes, I am never going to say that as prepared as you can be for death, it does not mean that it's not going to be painful and it's not going to be a process. But the process can be healthier and maybe a little bit easier if you're prepared.
Yes, absolutely. And then what I discovered that it sounds like you're seeing as well, what I discovered in hospice is that there's this potential for transformation when people come to terms with their mortality. And in hospice, it's happening for people as they're on their deathbed. And so they don't have a lot of time that they can live and enjoy life fully after this awakening to mortality because they're almost at the very end. But when people learn about death and dying and accept it and face it earlier in life, it changes all the rest of life afterwards. So that's what's so beautiful about taking a group of 20-year-olds and talking to them about this subject.
I think that's why I love it so much, is because I get to watch them go through this transformation. And of course, I don't have the same effect on all of my students, but even if I can get all of my students talking about it and learning about it, then the impact has occurred. But those students that, like I said, come back a year, 2 years later and say, oh my gosh, my life is completely different because I took this class. And it's not because death and dying is so life-altering. It's the fact that they've, like you said, accepted their own mortality and kind of have decided, I'm going to live life.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Such a beautiful gift that they've been given through your class.
That they've taken. And that's, I think, the coolest thing about this, Karen, is that they are taking it. They seize an opportunity, and all I'm doing is giving them the information and allowing them to run with it how they want to. And I think that's another reason why I love this so much, is because I can just watch these people. I wish I had before and after pictures with some of them at the beginning of the semester and the end of the semester. Because they
wow.
even physiologically look a little different.
Wow. Yeah, that would be really cool. That would be a very cool study to do, like before and after surveys of your students or something.
You know what? That actually would be. That would probably legitimize people wanting to take this class in college campuses being more supportive of it.
Yeah.
We could say, here's some data.
Yeah, how true. Oh, well, Stacy, I'm not overstating this or exaggerating it. I really feel like you're helping to change the world in such a positive way, and I'm really impressed with what you're doing. And I understand you're saying it's within the students themselves to seize the opportunity to take the information, but they wouldn't have the opportunity without you and your willingness and your passion to offer them the information. So I just want to thank you. Thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So I'm a huge fan and a huge supporter, and I'm excited to just I'm just hoping there will be a ripple effect from this conversation, that there will be people out there who say, hey, I've been looking for something to do. I could teach a class. I have the skills. I have the knowledge. And I believe there are people out there. So if you're hearing this conversation and you feel inspired, please don't hesitate to act on it and take a look around and see what you can do in your own community to educate people about death and dying. So, Stacy, I just want to thank you so much for taking time out from your schedule to talk with me.
Oh my gosh, Karen, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's been really fun to talk with you. So
I love talking about this stuff.
I know, it's obvious, and it makes it fun for everyone else listening too. I do want to thank everyone who's listening in today, and hoping some of you are feeling inspired right now to start your own class. So I hope you enjoyed that interview with Stacy Smith about teaching a college course in death and dying. I'm sure you found, as I did, Stacy is just vivacious and full of energy. You can imagine she's a fantastic teacher. Her students really love her. But I was eager to share with you Stacy's tips for how to put together a college class. And as you probably gathered from Stacy's talk, she had never taught this subject before, but she was interested in it. And so she really put her class together by seeking out experts in the community and getting them to bring their expertise into the classroom in areas where she was lacking in information. And she also mentioned that she used a textbook in the beginning to get her classes started and taught from a textbook. But now, after a few years, she doesn't use the textbook at all. So I thought that was really interesting. She did mention that some of the field trips she takes her class on, they visit a historic cemetery in the area. They also visit with the coroner and tour the morgue. And she has me as one of the guest lecturers. I come and talk about hospice and death and dying within the medical system, the medical aspect of death. And she brings in an attorney to talk about estate planning and end-of-life planning, a visit with a funeral director. And she tries to take a broad perspective in general on death and dying to expose the students to lots of different information. She did mention also that she has the students do a lot of reflective writing so that she can check in with them once a week and just see how they're doing. And she's prepared that some students may get triggered by the information that they're learning about and may feel a little overwhelmed. So she's always on the lookout for any students that are having difficulty adjusting. And because it's a college course for credit, if you were teaching a community workshop and someone was struggling with it, they could just drop out and not attend. But because it's a college course and students have paid to be there, the students are less likely to not show up. They're likely to stay there and might be experiencing distress during the class. Stacy is a psychologist, so she's able to really help her students process any emotional issues that arise during the class. But she recommended, you don't have to be a psychologist to teach a class like this, but she recommended that you stay connected if you are within a school system with the school's mental health professionals so that you can make referrals if you have a student who's not handling it well or that you think might need some extra counseling. One of the things I love that Stacy said is that half of what goes on in the classroom she couldn't pay to have happen. And so she talked about how she uses current events and things that happen in the community in the moment, also things that are coming up and stories that arise from the students in her classroom as teaching moments. And so she was saying how her syllabus is really kind of being rewritten all the time based on whatever is going on in the world and in the classroom as she's teaching the course, which I think is fantastic, makes it an absolutely wonderful course for students to be involved in. She said she feels the traits that she has that are most effective and helpful as a teacher for college students is to be flexible, to be open-minded, and being passionate. And she is definitely all three of those. Some of her specific tips, one were before you get started teaching a course is get the dean of the school or of the department where you want to teach on board with what you'd like to do. And that might take a few visits. It might, in order to get the dean in agreement and on your side. Also to know if there are state guidelines. So she's teaching a course in the psychology of death and dying, and there are state guidelines for what should be taught and what that course should consist of in order to meet guidelines. So she said it's important for you to do some research, do your homework, and find out if there are guidelines for the course you'd like to teach. She emphasized reaching out to people in the community, which makes it a really rich experience for students, and they get to know lots of experts in the field in the very community in which they're living. She did mention finding a textbook in the beginning for guidance, and the importance of figuring out what you're excited about. So, and that's one thing I mentioned in the teaching guidelines for a death and dying class as you are looking at what you might like to teach, is know what you're passionate about, what do you love, and what makes you come alive, because you will be the very best teacher for that information for your students. And finally, another thing, that I can't emphasize enough, the reason to teach a death and dying class of any type, and even if all you do is spend an hour telling someone about 5 wishes or the conversation project, if you do that only one time in your community, I guarantee you there will be a ripple effect from the teaching that you do, that each person who takes a class with you and learns from you is going to now become a teacher for someone else and go out and teach others in the community and share the knowledge they've gained from your class. And so I think I cannot overestimate how important it is for each one of us to become teachers. And I mentioned that last week when I talked about the importance of death education. Each one of us who cares about end-of-life issues and who wants to improve end-of-life care here in our society, we each need to take responsibility in our own way and step up and become not only a student, constantly learning as much as we can learn, but also teaching others and sharing with others what we know. So I hope you've been inspired by this interview with Stacey Smith, and that you'll go on to create your own class in death and dying of any sort, for any age group, for any group of people in any location. We need all of it. So go back and listen to last week's episode if you need more inspiration, and be sure to download the teaching guidelines for a death and dying class at eoluniversity.com/guidelines, and just to have available as a free little resource for you to look at. Also, remember the reading group I started this year called A Year of Reading Dangerously. You can join our group, and we're reading a book a month all year long about death and dying. For the month of February, we're reading Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by Caitlin Doty. In January, we read When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. And so you can go to the website, eoluniversity.com. You'll see a link there to sign up for the reading group. You'll get an email every month with the new book that we're reading and a reader's guide for that book. And you'll also be able to join our private Facebook group and take part in the discussions going on there about the books. So thank you once again for tuning in. I always love sharing information with you. There will be a new episode every week, so tune back in again next Monday for something new. And until we connect again, remember to face your fear, be ready for whatever life brings you, and love your life. Love every moment of it. Until the next time, take care and goodbye.